everybody. Hi. Zodwa, Skeyi-Tutani. I will be kind of sharing, and I'll just let them do all the work. So today this talk is called Jiva Babes. We're not really on a Jiva yet. That's like on the last night. They're talking about South African popular culture music. Yeah. So over to Kerry.
Hi guys. You'll see on the schedule the title is slightly different. I've changed it to Rearticulation of Colored Masculine Identity, Youngsta CBT, the hip-hop icon of the mother city. And here are two images of Youngsta in the south. You can see they've got quite different tones. Apparently this happens, I've been warned. You'll notice also that Kaapstad, which is Cape Town, is on both of the images as well. So just a brief overview, we're going to talk about the hip-hop within South Africa as well as the world, the formation of coloured identity during apartheid and beyond, risk and respectability within the Cape Plat, specifically as this relates to masculinity, and then I'll focus on 2 tracks, Arabian Gangster and Top 10 List. Alright, so hip-hop within the US. So hip-hop started in the US, didn't originally start as protest music, but it developed into protest music in the 1980s. It was aligned with race, and it was seen as an expression of the forbidden content of an apparently egalitarian society, and of course represented the things that were not egalitarian. Another aspect of rap was that black youth found a lot of guidance within the mentors that the rap artists themselves provided, as well as positive articulations of their identities. Okay, so hip-hop within South Africa, it was birthed in Cape Town, also in the 1980s. It provided a platform to investigate and rework the experiences of the class, gendered and raced body. And it was used to expose the situations in the townships. A specific example of this is Prophets of the City. I don't know if any of you know them, but they used a lot of sort of video footage from journalists who were around during events of police brutality, etc. within townships. And here's a little image of them. I would suggest checking them out on YouTube. They've got some really cool stuff. So hip-hop within South Africa today speaks to the disillusionment of the post-1994 era. It specifically talks to the culture of violence, which continues, including incidents of police brutality. Marikana is a famous example of that. And it also talks to the fact that many citizens have begun to lose hope in the healing of racial and economic segregation within the country. But one of the more positive things that hip-hop has seen is a period in which all the meanings of the race body have been transformed and reworked to be more self-affirming and to come from within the communities themselves. So just to talk a bit about the formations of coloured identity, during the apartheid government, coloured identity was labelled as a result of miscegenation, which is an old eugenicist concept that refers to people born out of the sexual relations between the white master and the black slave. So because of this, it had associations of shame, immorality, illegitimacy, impurity, and untrustworthiness. The Black consciousness movement within South Africa during the pre-1994 period also tended towards a universal and singular notion of being black, which further excluded coloured people from the struggle groups and communities within this period of South Africa. So there was a tendency within rap, and Prophets of the City did this, where artists denounced their coloured heritage and chose to sort of label themselves as black. However, they were always labeled as black of a special kind, which highlights the instability and insecurity of this particular racial position within South Africa and South African history. So beyond apartheid, you started to see a rejection of this combination of non-white identity into black identity, where people asked for coloured identity to be understood as a form of creolized cultural identity that went beyond the phenotypical features of these people and with the heritage that they have. So Erasmus talks about how the detailed bodies of knowledge, specific cultural practices, memories, rituals, and modes of being call for coloured identity to be understood as a complex cultural form of identity. The result is that you see a rejection of the label coloured identity as being only white imposed, and a movement towards reclaiming and redefining this form of identity from within the communities themselves. So this was obviously a very empowering movement. So this is where Youngsta comes in. CPT stands for Cape Town, for anyone who doesn't know. He grew up in Wynberg, which is an area of the Cape Flats, and he is of Cape Malay descent and has Muslim heritage and aligns himself with the Muslim faith. So he says his mission is to uplift CBT and just embrace who we are as coloured people. So he's clearly working to feel proud and to empower coloured communities. He calls himself Young van Riebeck, which I think is a really lovely notion that clearly shows resistance towards the colonial legacy associated with coloured identity and his movement to take ownership of the history and to bring it back into the coloured voice itself. So he says, I want everyone in the world, and I'm talking everyone, to know where Cape Town is and to know what Cape Town is about, the people that inhabit Cape Town, because there's no one else like us in the entire world. So before I go into an analysis of the songs, just to kind of frame it with the discussion around risk and respectability, this is an important concept when you talk about masculinity within the Cape Flats, because it is obviously quite notorious for gang activity and expressions of very violent masculinities. So young men are required to navigate the risk between being seen as a real man and being seen as a respectable one. There's also a lot of pressure from within the communities themselves for young men to subvert the stereotype of coloured men as violent and aggressive and as a gangster. So research done by Larkin and Van Beek goes into this negotiation, and their results showed that while gangsters can be seen as real men, they fail to achieve the status of respectable men. Respectability, on the other hand, can achieve the status of being both a real man and a respectable one, according to the primary traits of loyalty to family, being an upstanding moral citizen, and being a role model for the youth, with this last one seeming to kind of be the umbrella above everything else. So Youngsta speaks about this sort of tension between demonstrating the very real lived experiences of violence and also being a role model for his community. So he says, there are people in Cape Town who hate the way I rap because they say it's a stereotypical view of coloured people, and I understand. It's like if you get out the taxi after a hard day of work and a gangster threatens you, and then later you hear me on the radio speaking in this exact same way, you'll think, can't this just get away from me? At the end of the day, it's just my take on the lifestyle that I've lived. Okay, so my PowerPoint is a bit old, so I'm just having to do this a little bit old-fashioned way.
24/7 shit, Taliban 9/11 shit. Plan that they rocket provoke the attack, but they still have produced no evidence, and they still have the same image job of us. Cape Town is 800,000 plus, a large population. We starting a nation, so almost half of the Cape is Arabian association with gangs at home. Pocket is around if you have been born. Every single day a new gangster is born. The cycle continues back and forth. South Africa's torn, divided by race. The people who fought me like it was a waste. 20 years later, we in the same place. The Cape isn't safe. I'm making you face of the problems we face. Stating my case and I leave it on the record for all to see. If nobody listens, then they will say the conversations between Allah and me.
Okay, so that's just a little snippet from Arabian Gangster. It's one of my favorite tracks by Youngsta. And I don't really have time to get into all of the issues of this track, but I just wanted to highlight a few things. So the first is the line, they still have the same image now of us. He's referring to not only Islamophobia, but he's referring to the image of Cape coloured men within Cape Town and the association with gangsters that we've just discussed. So the cycle continues back and forth. He's clearly talking about the period of disillusionment which South Africa is now experiencing in its post-apartheid era. So association with gang is the norm, Pachad is around and you have been warned. For anyone who doesn't know, Pachad stands for People Against Gangs and Drugs. They are a sort of known as an Islamic fundamentalist vigilante group that came about in the 1990s in response to the police's inability to protect the people of South Africa. And a lot of theory is done around pakhat and how they came to be, but one of the things which I find quite interesting is negotiations around pakhat being a response to threatened masculinity, where that masculinity feels it cannot protect its family, so it resorts to violence as a means to do what the police are not doing, effectively. And I think Youngsta is saying two things here. On the one hand, I think he is critiquing pakhat for bringing the name of Islam and Muslim people down and reassociating it with violence. But on the other hand, I also think he is talking about the natural consequences which occur when the state fails to protect its people, and highlighting that pakhat didn't come about in a vacuum. They came about because of a lack of needs not being met effectively within the community. Sorry about that. Okay, and then this is my favorite line of the whole track. If nobody listens, then I will say the conversations between Allah and me. So going back to risk and respectability, I think what he is doing here is demonstrating to the youth, say your story, say what needs to be said, tell your version of events, but at the same time, there's an alternative means of coping that doesn't need to go back to violence, doesn't need to go to things like pakhat, groups like pakhat. There is an alternative way where you can find peace and hope and healing within your religion, within your family, and within these community spaces. So yeah, he's offering a positive role model to his community in that sense. Okay, so then top 10 list is an incredibly different track, just as a heads up.
Few discrepancies I'd like to address. Yeah, I'm probably never gonna make the #1 spot, but I can tell you right now a couple names must be chopped. You got any so what? Maybe do a quick swap. You met the more third shot, not hip hop. And let me share what it was. I'm open to the criticism, but when lyricism is just that I must insist that you just in yourself to give attention to other places and don't waste the song friendship. But some of them is no one not that many. Cape Town's all it seems. Why you act like me?
Okay, so before I go into the graphic imagery that he uses in this track, I just want to give some context to its meaning. So it was brought out in response to the MTV Top 10 list of South African artists within 2015. And he's referring to the dysfunctional nature of South Africa's music industry, where location and access to resources is what primarily defines your success. So in South Africa, you see the rap industry and music industry taking place primarily in Gauteng, where Cape Town is almost forgotten about, despite the fact that rap originates from Cape Town within South Africa. So just to expand on this, there's a term payola within the industry where this refers to the barriers to entry. So as an example, an artist Pretty Ugly from Gauteng talks about when he was approached by one of the top compilers in South Africa and told that he can be made the hottest artist if he pays a deposit of 16,000 rand to get airtime on the radio. So the ability to achieve success within South Africa relies a lot less on your lyrical talent, which is what Youngsta is highlighting through his own display of brilliant lyricism, but more on your access to resources and on your economic status, effectively. So just to talk about the graphic imagery or the images of war, what's interesting here is that he uses Cape Town's violent legacy to instill fear into those who he deems as usurping Cape Town hip-hop artists. So the imagery here is not a fantasy. He's drawing on a very real fear that people within Cape Town experience based on the presence of gangs and intense gang violence that takes place, which I find quite interesting. And I've sort of thought about it a lot and narrowed the reasoning to why he might have done this down to three things. And the first is having an experience of threatened masculinity by not achieving the status that he wanted, and by responding to that feeling of threat with hyper-masculine gestures. And then the second thing is the desire to achieve acknowledgement. So after this track was released, it blew up online. There are blogs about it, the Design and Job was posted about it. YouTube, it's got a huge hit list. So it did bring a lot of attention to Youngsta, and I think there's something to be said about the shock factor of it and the fact that it works commercially. So there is also this commercial element that's taking place within rap. And then the third thing is the lived experience, where I think Youngsta, it relates to the threatened masculinity, where in some ways I think he's saying, you know, you are posing these barriers to entry within the music industry, but at the same time, I have survived so much worse. Look at where I come from. I come from the Cape Flats and I come from a ghetto area. I know how to survive. So one of the things I did critique him for in this track within my paper is that he risks reshackling the image of the colored man to the stereotype of violent and threatening, to the idea of a gangster. So just to conclude, what I do think is shown through Youngsta is the power of music to re-articulate the meanings given to various forms of identity. However, his music also shows us the risk of fetishizing violence and reshackling communities to the stereotypes from which they wish to distance themselves. Within hip-hop, the issue of representations of masculinity is central, given the legacy of hip-hop, of rap, as revealing the forbidden truths within society, specifically as they relate to violence in this instance. So the question becomes, and this is not maybe so much a question for you, although take it how you want, but a question for artists themselves, and specifically male or masculine artists, is how to navigate the risks of perpetuating violent masculinities while still representing the lived experiences of incredibly harsh environments. Thanks.
Thank you, Kerry. So next we will have Lerato Nkadimeng with Imagining Affective Futures in Kelela's work.
Slides prepared, but looks like this will probably not my finish, so I'll just go down them. I've emailed it to myself.
I can try to get it.
No, that's okay. I'll just start in the meantime. I'll move the visuals towards the end. So my paper is called Imagining Affective Futures in Kelela's work. Kelela is an Ethiopian-American singer and songwriter. Her discography includes her 2017 debut album, Take Me Apart, the extended play Hallucinogen, and a mixtape entitled Cut For Me. Her work can be described as R&B with threads of electronic music running through it. In her music, Kelela repeatedly considers ideas of subjection to the conditions around her, as well as her own feelings and experiences. The sense of subjection is often accompanied by continuous descriptions of not having words that can truly describe these sensations and moments. So within a space where words cannot reach, but animative possibilities exist, Kelela offers a visual image as a means of representing the experiences of these senses. Through her music videos, Kelela imagines the image of herself and her body as fluid. She reshapes and reconfigures it in ways that convey the impact of affective processes on it. In considering the ways that Kelela produces effective modes of reconfiguring the body, I aim to highlight the following. First, the place of recognizing subjection. and the consequential choice of aiming to thrive in what Kelela calls an unkind world. Then secondly, the state of silence and wordlessness, and how it opens up other forms of expression. And thirdly, how in response to replacing the space that words might otherwise take up, Kelela's choice to develop a fluid body, one that is continuously reconfigured and reimagined in various forms. What I ultimately aim to do here is consider how Kelela develops a form of imagining a black futurity through an affective body. These affective possibilities are developed extensively through visual imagery, and with that in mind, I'll make reference to two music videos from this first album, her debut album. Again, my understanding of affect through Sarah Ahmed's work on sensation. She describes sensation as something that arouses the senses, particularly the body, and how the body feels itself being in touch with the world. She suggests that sensation is a way of beginning to think about how a body does not fit into the world. And in conceiving of a body that is in relation to the world around it, sensation becomes the evidence of that experience. In an interview, Kelela describes the world as one that is unkind to black girls and women by default. The intersection of racism and misogyny becomes a normative mode of engaging with black girls and women in various ways. In describing the world in this way, in naming it as unkind, she recognizes the sensation of being perceived as antagonistic. Cara Keeling describes blackness as something that agitates a category of human. She argues that black subjectivities are positions that haunt, and I quote, the human's past, present, and future. In haunting the human, blackness always potentially displaces the notion of an absolute normative mode of relation. And Kelela arrives to a sentiment similar to Keeling's, and an example of this is in an Instagram post. She shares an early experience in which a preschool teacher teaches her to pronounce her name. She does it incorrectly, and Kelela, then 5 years old, is brushed off when she attempts to correct her. She explains that this early experience formed the rest of her childhood, where she assimilated into this Americanized version of herself, a version that she explains was easier for everyone else to digest. Now an adult, she reflects on how the teacher's correction was less about how inappropriate she inherently is in these contexts, but rather the inability of America to recognize and engage with her as she exists. The recognition of one's body as one that puts the world around them ill at ease produces a sense of alienation. The recognition of the way one's body exists in the world is instantly accompanied by the sensation of being displaced within a world. The headline of an interview describes Kelela as a woman who thrives in an unkind world. In many words, this unkind world is one that manifests in many forms, within the music industry, the United States, the earth in its entirety. In Kelela's interior world, through past memories that are evoked into the present and the possible future. The world is able to reproduce itself in various ways, both external to the body and within the interiority of the subject. But geographies of these antagonistic and problematic structures are not clearly defined and transparent. Ahmed recalls Audre Lorde's observation that difficulties resist being understood as soon as they are identified. And Keeling reiterates this when she observes how the spatial coordinates of black inferiority, that is the tangible source of that inferiority, are obscured through obliteration and universalism. In obscuring its specificity, it is much more difficult to identify those forces that hurt black women especially. In addition to this, when one attempts to not only identify it, but to problematize the way society is structured too, they are in turn regarded as the problem. Language is a potentially tangible form of these difficulties. There are multiple degrees at which existing language is seen as incapable of holding space for marginalized subjects. For instance, writer Amani bin Shakan suggests that the English language is incapable of recognizing Kelela in full. She argues that just within the English language alone, there is space that cannot be held to recognize the time and space that Kelela both occupies and emerges from. She observes that Kelela shares her name with an Amharic folk song that roughly translates to, Kelela is her home, and her bullet is shiny. She writes that English is too dull to understand what the original folk song conveys. Similarly describing the landscape of the American music industry, Kelela says, the American psyche can't really process black women, especially without a major label behind them. What then holds this world together, especially in this nature, is a manner in which Kelela understands that she is constituted, the ways that she is constituted within it. The sensation of being faced with these difficulties, of, as Ahmed terms it, and I quote, recognizing yourself as a problem, becomes a consistency of an unkind world. In recognizing the world as unkind and unwilling to meaningfully recognize her, Kelela, through her music and various images, goes to lengths to exit this world by creating an alternative social reality. As listeners and viewers, we are led to this social reality, first by the recognition of displacement. A running theme in Kelela's work is the sense of not having the words that can describe the moments that she conveys to the listener. It often happens that the state comes with feelings of frustration and abjection, and at other times, total bliss and comfort. When she identifies silence in this repetitive way, it produces the effect of silence being an active process of effective production of identity. The silences in Kelela's work are self-aware and pensive. The thought of feeling and feeling in and of itself cannot happen without silence. Silence becomes the evidence of experience in this way. So, in recognition of this experience that is significantly directed inwards, and in a position of needing to express this experience in the embodiment of the state of being, how does Kelela share this inner world in a way that is both recognizable but transgressive of these boundaries of validation produced by racism and sexism? Affection, as a sense of embodying oneself, becomes a means of translating the space held by silence and wordlessness into the image. Keeling argues that affection definitively shapes the body of the image. Affection is described as the body's effort to make itself. In another sense, affection has the potential to project one's inner world into images that can be disseminated to an audience. Affection also displaces the erasure that can come with the universalism. It becomes the representation of the individual's perception. Kelela's music becomes a site of expression where she exercises her own ability to express and to further her aims. She recognizes that along with her visibility, her music and its accompanying media and performance, that all of these can be a temporal site of refuge. In the way that she uses it, silence is a deliberate choice that creates a space for marginalized people. Silence is a recognition that in the face of this burden of navigating oppressive social realities, there are spaces and possibilities for other modes of living to be found in silence and states of wordlessness. Here, we can locate the potential for otherworldly forms of producing identity and reconfiguring the ways that we imagine the world would relate to us. In her music videos, Kelela's body becomes an avatar that changes and adapts according to the message of the text, be it the song in tandem with the visual imagery, or the song in and of itself. Kelela then distorts the body through various changes. These include extending the body's dimensions, reimagining it through digital art, removing it from immediately recognizable social realities, transferring her likeness into spaces vaguely familiar but ultimately alien. Each time, these representations are vaguely recognizable as human, but through these reconfigurations, the image of Kelela's body is contested as human. The sensation of the human being removed to some extent is emphasized throughout the visual. It is unavoidable as the video insists upon this recognition. Kelela exploits and extends the black subject's ability to point to the human. The displacement of the human in the context of these music videos then further displaces the notion of blackness as a sensation of alienation. As a subjective position, it is situated in a chronology of humanity that defines time in a separate way. So these are two screenshots from a single from this last album of Kelela's called Blue Lights. It came out earlier this year. So in this music video, Kelela stands solitarily against a blue background. As the video progresses, her hair, seemingly alive, animated, gradually undresses her and entwines itself around her body, ultimately engulfing her in her entirety in this volume scripture. The music video for Blue Lights is sensuous. Initially, the viewer's gaze is held by Kelela's direct stare, but as it goes on, she breaks it. Her eyes, as her hair increasingly takes control of her, are closed in complete pleasure. The music video engages with the idea of subjection. Here it considers it specifically as a form of release. In an earlier music video released in 2015 for the single Message, Kelela looks directly into the camera as she cuts her dreadlocks with a pair of scissors. In that video, it is an act of control. Blue Light then is something of an inversion of that earlier video. In this case, that it is her own hair, a form of expression that she maintains a sense of control over, that ultimately controls her in this video, inverts the notion of subjection as an oppressive experience, and instead frames it as a form of liberation, one that is inward-facing and externalized through the representation of the image. Then, this is from the second single from this last album. It's called Frontline. It was released around March. So in Frontline, Kelela revisits the memory of breaking up with an ex-boyfriend. She drives a white convertible Mercedes-Benz that takes the viewer through a road, the ruins of the city, and her memories of the relationship. The music video for Frontline is reminiscent of the computer game, The Sims 2, a simulation game in which the player controls the lives of human-like characters. The player can make the choice to guide their Sims towards their destiny, or to take complete control of them. Like the computer game, this music video develops a literal landscape that opens itself up to world-making possibilities. With her car and a sense of purpose, Kelela's sim-like character travels through multiple temporalities. What ties each of these different sides is the drive of her purpose, this being the desire to resolve her place within this relationship, and the displacement of a sense of self that was previously secure. It is towards the end of the video that one can begin to recognize the geography of the setting as less of a physical one and more of an affective city. The city's decay becomes more evident as Kelela comes to terms with the end of her relationship. The ambiguity of its limits eventually develop a sense of optimism and a forward-looking turn towards the future, as Kelela is this version of a sim and two friends do a dance routine that can only be reminiscent of R&B music videos of the early 2000s. This music video in particular develops an affective landscape, inviting the viewer not to consider just the digital imagery of it, but the possibilities that exist beyond a physical body. To conclude, Kelela breaks from a common sense understanding of the possibilities of a body like hers, black and female. And within this break, we can locate a new common sense of time-space sensibilities. Body that changes on a whim, one that is impacted upon and changed from affects that emerge from within, is one that displaces an understanding of time and space as one that follows a normative chronology. It's within this space that I locate the futurist possibilities of a world that exists beyond the capacities of this unkind one.
Thank you, Lerato. I thought you were going to cancel, that's what I understand. I had a bit of a pause there. So next up we have Busiswa and Msezane. She's speaking on Lebo Mathosa, genre as a compass for gender performance.
My paper is titled Mathosa, Genre as a Compass for Gender Performance. It's a Saturday afternoon in the summer of 1996, and millions of young South Africans across the country stare at their television screens, anticipating the new episode of their favorite youth-based variety show, Skeyi-Tutani, aired on SABC1. The channel etches ideas of a rainbow nation with its Simunye, We Are One, logo mirroring the country's hopes in the wake of the first democratic elections, held just 2 years prior. Then, South Africa felt like a new place, as if someone had pushed the reset button and given the country a second chance to start afresh after the nightmare of apartheid. This air of bringing in the new was prevalent in the music industry, with the advent of a new genre called Kwaito. Solo acts and ensembles such as Mdu, TKZ, Trompies, Alaska, and Bongo Muffin created music that acted as a soundtrack for the lives of millions of young South Africans who wanted to be free from the oppression of the apartheid era. Kwaito ensembles addressed the materialistic and hedonistic aspirations of the black urban youth, as well as the tumultuous environment of which they were products. And on that Saturday evening, in 1996, viewers would be entertained by one of the many ensembles that were known to do so. After 25 minutes of watching edits covering the glitzy event attended by the creme de la creme of Johannesburg, Dosto Noche at the studio set of Skeyi-Tutani announces that Boom Shaka, one of the post-apartheid year's seminal Kwaito groups, will appear on stage to perform their new hit song, Kelela. Two young women adorned in bright orange and yellow suits and white sky-high platform heels entice the audience members to join them on stage as they sway their hips to the thumping synth beat playing in the background. The male members of the group, Theo Ntlangetwa and Junior Sokela, stand beside these women, nodding their heads to the beat and watch in approval as Lebo Mathosa in the orange suit and Thulisile in the yellow outfit energetically sing the first verse. The young women execute their choreography to a T as the audience continues to gather around them on stage. The camera gradually pans to Nkadimeng as he bursts into chorus singing and waving Kelela, meaning hello, repeatedly as the crowd goes wild. He then makes way for Sokela to rap in a reggae style the second verse of the song, and in turn is followed by Sieto, who raps in a call and response style Kelela with up-and-coming Kwaito sensation Tebe as they lead into the final chorus. The group indeed reflects the aspirations of urban black youths across the country. They are young, vibrant, sexually unrestrained, and stylish, and they embodied a level of success that many young people aspired to at the time. Boom Shaka's rise to fame was a double-edged sword, as they were popular amongst the youth but disapproved of by the parental generation for their provocative dress sense and dance moves. The screams of disapproval were at an all-time high after the release of the band's rendition of the national anthem, where the elected president at the time, Nelson Mandela, publicly shunned the band and accused them of setting the wrong example for the youth. The women in particular came under severe scrutiny for the revealing outfits they wore during their stage performances and public appearances, which, unlike the suits worn on Skeyi-Tutani, consisted of tight leather crop tops and shorts and cut-out skirts and dresses. Such was the notoriety gained by Boom Shaka's female members that noted American feminist musicologist Susan McClary discussed how the ensemble drew attention to women Kwaito performers' expression of agency in performance, which fused sexuality with gender and national identity and the liberation from apartheid, as displayed, for example, in their performance of their rendition of Kelela. Mathosa and Sieto's participation in their sexual objectification, according to Angela Impi, was an empowering method to assert both a presence in the music industry and their sexual agency. The significance of this was that it occurred in a patriarchal industry and genre. Men have always been dominant in Kwaito's production that rendered women as unequal to their male counterparts, not permitting them to function as authors and producers of the music, but rather to assume the role of, and I quote,
I'm Jamie Lee with WritersLife.org.
and I quote, highlighters adding color through the explicit pornographic representation of their bodies. In Boom Shaka, by contrast, the male and female members of the band performed the verses and choruses interchangeably in each song, which in turn could be seen as balancing out the power dynamics, such that the members were equals rather than the female performers being an echo to the men whose parts carry the performance. So dependent on Lebo Mathosa was Boom Shaka that when Mathosa left the group in 2000 to pursue a solo singing career, the group disbanded. With Mathosa negotiating full publishing rights to her music with EMI Records Africa. This reveals Mathosa's awareness of the gender dynamics that characterize the South African music industry. She was conscious, as she said in an interview, of women being pressured to, and I quote, sleep with someone to get into the recording studio, end quote, or be in a position where they are not empowered enough to own their own compositions. Branching out as a solo act presented Mathosa the opportunity to have the singular creative freedom and expression that she did not have in the collective band setting. She expanded the range of genres she employed in her music, and I'll argue that her referencing of different genres influenced her performance of gender revealing and awareness of the gendered aesthetics of these genres. My paper thus aims to explore how genre influences Mathosa's performance of gender in her solo work, and how she expresses her sexual agency visually, musically, and lyrically. Moreover, these gendered performances by Mathosa are posited as feminist and will be analyzed within the feminist musicology discourse. Feminist musicology is a practice based on recognizing women who have been marginalized in music. It has mainly focused on the representation and contribution of women in music, and can be credited for excavating the long-standing participation of women in music-making processes and bringing those to the forefront within male-dominated industries. Moreover, it provides feminist critiques of already existing musical worlds. This has been necessary because entrenched gender norms have permeated into music and thus affect how women are represented in music. Feminist musicologist writers have rejected such logic, as it legitimizes, for example, male aggression and the sexual exploitation of women in music. These critiques thus reveal the inequalities faced by women in music and how men have perpetually reinforced these stereotypes and used them to marginalize women and maintain their dominance. Furthermore, feminism in musicology has shown how women have transcended these oppressive stereotypes and reclaimed their power in popular music genres such as punk rock and hip-hop, where women rappers have emancipated themselves from the sexual oppression and exploitation imposed upon them. Many of the concerns regarding feminist musicology in the West centered on the relocation of women within existing classical and jazz music canon, which is dominated by men, rather than questioning the status quo within which women were expected to assimilate. As a South African academic, I find myself in a different position, where women's involvement in Kwaito, just as in classical music, has been relegated to a mere footnote. But on a similar note, Kwaito and its foremost exponents and their music have been poorly documented within musicology. Therefore, the existing Kwaito canon itself has not been written about in an in-depth and comprehensive manner. Framing my discussion of Mathosa's performance within feminist musicology is an attempt to bring Black women's narrative to the long-standing and ongoing insertion of women-centered discussion within the discourse. My main focus in this regard will be on her music rather than solely on the pop culture production. As previously stated, the aim of this presentation is to analyze and discuss how genre influences Mathosa's performance of gender in her music. I initially intended on analyzing 3 songs, but due to time constraints, I have limited my analysis to one song, which is the dancehall-infused tune titled Make Way, taken from her 3rd studio album, Lioness. I chose this album because it reflects her maturity as a songwriter and solo artist. It was the last album she released before her untimely death at the age of 29 in October 2006. Mathosa had hit the pinnacle of her career with the release of her previous album, Drama Queen, that afforded her the opportunity to tour Africa with the launch of MTV Base in 2005. She had also caused a stir in Britain that same year, having attended the MTV Europe Awards with MTV creator Bill Ruby. These events served as a perfect springboard to release new music. According to a makeup artist, the late Iko Mash, it was the beginning of what Lebo Mathosa is about, vocally in control of her persona and everything. She knew exactly who she wanted to work with and what music she wanted to make. Kwaito was produced by black people for a largely black listenership, and was the first black-controlled music industry in South Africa, thus representing a shift in economic power in the music market in the early post-apartheid era. Black popular music genres were both a commodity and a public medium that helped shape audiences' notion of self, emotions, gender, desire, pleasure, the body, and much more. Mathosa offered provocative and innovative ways of looking at the processes of sexualization as they related to the ways of viewing the body, rather than solely recognizing them within the context of heteropatriarchal wounds brought about by the HIV/AIDS discourse, female genital mutilation, and virginity discourse at the time. These discourses were and still are important and prevailed amid Mbeki's denialist politics about the HIV and AIDS pandemic and the alarming increase in gender-based violence in the country. The Unilever Institute of Strategic Marketing at the University of Cape Town issued grim statistics of surveys conducted in 2004, finding that at least 1 in 3 South African women can expect to be raped in her lifetime, and 1 in 4 will be beaten by her domestic partner. The time of Lioness in 2006 was a precarious time for the liberated displays of sensuality and sexuality represented by Mathosa. Mathosa continued to incorporate in her own work the genres she had performed extensively with Boom Shaka, but extended and personalized her interpretation of those genres in her solo work. Mathosa's reference to a variety of music genres allows her to express and critique several gendered subject positions in her solo work, positions that create a more complex gendered identity than the dominant image of Mathosa that the public had been exposed to during her Boom Shaka days. One such genre that she adapts and explores throughout her oeuvre is dancehall, specifically in her second album Drama Queen in the song Dangerous, and in Lioness in the songs Make Way and Dance With Me. In her comparative work, Sonia Stanley Nair discusses the production of transnational cultures between Africa and its diasporas, specifically between South Africa and Jamaica, where communities are created beyond displacement, colonization, and enslavement through music and performance. One of the genres she considers in that project is dancehall, a genre, social movement, a space, a language, and much more that emerged from Kingston, Jamaica, and gained popularity in the 1950s, the name from which emerged from the yards in which the dance events were mainly held. Dancehall venues functioned as a space that allowed lower-class Jamaicans to assert a new sense of self that reflected the beat and tempo of the music and dance, a space where the DJ or dance queen could achieve the fame of a prime minister. Dancehall emerged from a lower-class generation that sought independence from British colonial rule, while Kwaito emerged in the wake of a post-apartheid democratic era in South Africa. The parallels between the genres reveal both the cross-fertilization that occurs between transnational terrains that reference each other and the need for liberated forms of expressions for black youth rooted within the genres. And much like Jamaican dancehall, Kwaito has been disparaged as misogynistic, homophobic, and dehumanizing to both men and women. It is considered a heteronormative space that displays the ongoing battles between men and women, where the lyrical content treats women as mindless bodies that should be consumed for male pleasure, vis-a-vis men being stereotyped as dark-hearted predators stalking for potential victims. In short, dancehall is a heterosexual space in which men and women play out eroticized gender roles in a ritual drama that can become violent. Dancehall, and Kwaito too, one can argue, also offered a liberating space in which working-class women and their more timid middle-class sisters assert the freedom to play out eroticized roles that may not ordinarily be available to them in the rigid social conventions of the everyday. According to one line of argument then, dancehall became a space where women could regain control over the misogynistic representations of their bodies brought about by the male gaze. Women could transcend the pornographic representation of the female body, especially within the dance halls where dancing had been considered as a licentious act. Cooper argues that the act of dancing for women in practicing dancehall was treated as a therapeutic and self-empowering act. Given the transcontinental ties that link dancehall and Kwaito, It is no surprise that Mathosa continued to incorporate the brazen genre in her sound world, as she had done with Kwaito Act Boom Shaka. Make Way is a sexually charged piece that presents the slackness often associated with dancehall. In keeping with the tradition of dancehall, the song's lyrical content centers on dancing and is a self-affirming statement. Mathosa describes a night out on the town where her movements on the dance floor are a liberating expression of self. Mathosa requires the listener to make way and let her into the dance floor venue so she can dance until the sunrise. In the first verse that you just heard, she delivers the lyrics in a typical singing style, enunciating each word in a smooth and stern manner, so as to reiterate the self-assertion that informs the lyrics. Mathosa switches to a strong patois accent and aggressively rap-sings the lyrics of the second verse in a hoarse tone. The aggressive delivery of the lyrics and hoarse tone give this verse a strange effect. This form of rap singing is a signature style drawn possibly from patois, formerly known as Lady Patois. This aggressive rap-sung delivery exhibited by Mathosa could possibly be due to the constraints placed on women in the past to adopt existing performing styles that were already established by men so as to assert their presence in dancehall. Moreover, the style of delivery conveys the unapologetic tone that Mathosa was clearly going for in Make Way. Mathosa plays numerous roles in the song. First, she articulates her self-affirming statements in the first verse and makes way for the backing vocals in the chorus to reaffirm what she has sung, as she interjects liberally. Her relation to the backing vocals in Make Way thus make it clear that she is the leader of the pack, who vocalizes the feelings of many women. Second, she makes way for featured rapper and former Boom Shaka bandmate Junior Sokela to reiterate her lyrics as she interjects in agreement. The gender roles in this instance have shifted such that Junior is there to support Mathosa rather than engage in a ritual drama that can become violent. Thus, the empowering aspect of the song for Mathosa stems from the fact that she only makes way for others to reaffirm what she has stated. Furthermore, she makes way for others in the song strictly on her terms in addition to making way for herself. There is no official music video, and I have not yet been able to locate a video recording of Mathosa's performance of Make Way, but one can deduce from the lyrics that Mathosa, in her visual interpretation of the song, might have adopted lingerie as streetwear, a move often made in the glamorous carnival pride in Caribbean societies. The dance hall would have been a theatrical space where Mathosa and a male counterpart seductively dance until the sunrise. She was known for releasing numerous energetic, professionally choreographed videos, as evident in those from Audete and Siyazwisa. In the latter, Mathosa and her backup dancers wear cock bras as streetwear with loose baggy jeans and track pants. They are fashioned in the fantastic undress code of the dancehall in Jamaica, which is a glamorous expression of a distinct cultural style that allows women the liberty to demonstrate the seductive appeal of the imaginary and of their bodies. Dancehall is thus not only a genre that Mathosa incorporates, but it also becomes a carnival where Mathosa abandons respectability and parades her nakedness and gets bad. She makes these aspects clear in Make with the lyrics, "I feel nothing at all when we're getting low," that can be interpreted as her saying that she's unashamed of her rebellious antics. In a performance of the song and the lyrics, she brings the radical essence of the dancehall back home to her South African sisters, who at the time and presently don't have the luxury to exist in spaces without fear of being sexually harassed. Mathosa's liberated performance when committed by an ordinary woman would possibly lead to humiliation at the hands of misogynists. One example of this incident of sexual harassment that occurred frequently at taxi ranks, places of the everyday for many South African women in South Africa. On the 17th of February 2008, just 2 years prior following the release of Lioness, Nwabisa Ngokana was stripped and assaulted by taxi drivers and informal traders at Mood Taxi Rank in central Johannesburg, and was an unsuspecting victim to a humiliating ritual that had been normalized at the time. Just a year prior, in July 2007, Zandile Mpanza was attacked by 4 men in Durban as a result of her non-compliance to the ban that prohibited women from wearing trousers at Umlazi T section. Mathosa's dancehall-inspired performances of Make Way, by contrast, epitomize the sexual liberation sought by many African working-class women in a patriarchal South African society that continues to favor absolute definitions of appropriate female behavior, especially for black women. Mathosa's continued insertions of black women's sexuality into mainstream music genres in South Africa at the time, amidst ongoing gender-based violence and policing of women's sexual agency, is a form of resistance. She makes way for her self-empowered sisters to continue to reject these problematic status quos. Sonically in Make Way, Mathosa is accompanied by a rhythm which consists of melodic and percussive ostinato made from sampled instruments. The song format incorporates a rhythm plus voicing format in which the producer of the song, or in this case the featured artist and former band member, Junior Sokela, rap sings ad-libs throughout the song, leading up to the rap, which is an affirmation of Mathosa's commanding lyrics. Dancehall, like Waito, is an extension of the society it spreaded, and both genres were used as what Susan C. Cook calls gender props, which is a method to reinforce and entrench the existing gender roles present in society. With the release of Lioness, Mathosa had come a long way in her solo career since her departure from Kumhlanga. The self-proclaimed drama queen envisioned herself breaking through popular music and social boundaries and considered Lioness a true reflection of the growth she had aimed for as an artist. Moreover, Mathosa's music was a form of resistance against the patriarchal notions present in the country, specifically around ideas on appropriate womanhood that were prevalent at the time of Youngsta. Many of the ways in which black women imagine feminism and post-coloniality are through creative mediums, not traditionally contained within the confines of theory building. Mathosa revealed her own understanding of feminism as a black woman in a post-apartheid era through her awareness and display of the gendered norms in dancehall. Almost done. Her body of work remains a relevant site for feminist musicology critique, as the numbers for gender-based violence continue to increase at this current juncture. Her untimely death in October 2006 has stripped us of the opportunity to witness the possibility of her adding to this legacy and to further provide a mainstream feminist critique. May her soul rest in peace and power.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. Sorry for going over time.
No worries. So next up we have Siphokazi Tau.
Oh, that's nice. Alright, so I'm just going to go for it.
Yep.
Okay, so my paper is like
basically a pet project that I've been obsessed with for quite some time. So thanks for being part of this process. I'm looking at what I call some generational inquiry into ideologies that we see Brenda Fassie, that I would then argue have migrated into the ideology and the music that Busiswa represents, right? So artists and creators are, as you know, products of the conditions and the environments of which that they emerge from, right? And at times, if not at all times, their work would be a reproduction of what is happening in those societies, right? So in this paper, I want to look at the idea of feminist expressions, aesthetics, and memory in highlighting selected works from Brenda Fassie and Busiswa, Gqulu respectively. I wish to argue that there is, firstly, some homology of a common thread in the way in which they use or employ deliberate feminist expressions in the lyrics of the music. And secondly, I argue that there is a migration of discourse or ideology, if you wish, from Brenda's personal and public life, which we see represented in Busiswa's aesthetic creations that inform her brand, particularly expressed within her music videos. Brenda Fassie, as we know, was a South African pop or Afro-pop singer, officially known as Mabur by her fans. She was born in Langa in 1964, one of the most revolutionary townships during the apartheid era. Her 1983 breakthrough hit Weekend Special, along with The Big Dudes, continues to be a hit in contemporary South Africa and still finds expression in the ever fast changing music scene. In 2011, Tata-born spoken word artist, poet Busiswa, famously known as Kalawa Chikita, released 2 songs, Siyapambana and My Name Is, which is more popular with DJ Zile. These instantly became club hits. Their lyrics contain elements of a carefree attitude, of one enjoying yourself, a trend, if you wish, that distinguishes Busiswa and Brenda's work respectively. From both these artists, we experience on one end the challenging of our conventional notions of womanhood and the politics of the respectability that is associated with it. On the other end, what we experience is the negotiation for alternative ways of representing this womanhood which we find within, or of representing that womanhood, sorry. So how then do we exist? Okay, so in noting the fact that South African women have various lived experiences, it's also important to note that although music communicates a particular message, it has nuanced meanings and interpretations that it carries. It is thus imperative that in reflecting on the conversations and narratives of our communities which are narrated in songs and in music, it's imperative to look at the relationship between those songs and who those songs are speaking to, and how that relationship between the two will influence, how the relationship between the song and who the song is determined for will then influence relationships within society. How then does music in its communication and multiple meanings center Black, and in particular Black women's ways of knowing and of thinking about who they are in society? I want to suggest that perhaps in looking at the relationship between Brenda and Busiswa, we're able to extract from it an understanding of how women come to take up the agency in both musical eras. I want to further argue that the music, which is to some extent influenced by the environments, means that they too become prisoners of these environments and societies, if you wish. And because of the reproduction of their music, they entrap themselves within these societal reproductions. Siri Hughes argues that although there is an abundance of popular music in South Africa, those styles have been ghettoized, as they were defined along racial and ethnic lines, as they were during apartheid. So in drawing from Brenda's 1989 song, Good Black Woman, in the song she says, so sorry, I'm not going to sing, otherwise I'll traumatize everyone. So in the song she says, early Monday morning, police arrest my brother for working for Black community. Monday afternoon, I went to see my brother. the policeman treated me like a donkey. I say to the policeman, you've got a bad attitude. Oh no, I'm no criminal. I'm a good black woman. If we are to argue that songs have an ethnic and racial constituents, in the song Brenda is centering the black woman. Interestingly, she uses the word good, of which that word has not been popularly associated in how you describe Brenda. A common word that one would use would be wild child of the townships. And this is not only because society at the time found her to be rebellious, but because Brenda herself, in terms of her personality, portrayed a very carefree, I don't play by the rules attitude, of which she suggests, in her lyrics on Indaba Yami Straight, I dig rula. So I'll explain. I'll do some translations as far as I can. And within the song Indaba Yami Straight, I dig rula, very loosely saying, well, she doesn't need anyone to define who she is or place her within, so she colors outside the lines, if you wish. There she locates her gender, her class, and identity politics. I want to argue that the idea of using the word good highlights as well the respectability politics in relation to black women who are expected to perform good behavior or good womanhood in a particular way. Knowing Brenda as the media would portray her would not, knowing Brenda as the media would portray her would not be passive in her articulation, as the song would suggest that she's negotiating with the policeman, arguably a white, to accept her as a good black woman, or in other words, to accept her as one who is not in resistance. According to Bruno Netto, music expresses personal or group identity. It plays a role in negotiating relationships between unequals, as a way for the dominant group to reinforce its hegemony or for a subordinate population to fight back at some level. Perhaps this reading of Brenda as resistance says more about the reader than it does about her. If we are to accept that Brenda is passive and agreeing to perform good black womanhood, then one neglects firstly the complexities that make up a person's character, of which both a calm and fire can exist in one. Secondly, I want to argue that the good womanhood performance could also be interpreted as a mere performance, of which performances at some point come to a close. I think it is also important to note that the passive reading exposes one's expectation of what good womanhood is supposed to look like, as one that is an either-or scenario, one that cannot be staged, and arguably one that undermines black women's cognitive processes and their ability to use a strategy, such as being passive, to suit a particular context. According to Stanley Fish's interpretive community theory, interpretive communities are made up of those who share interpretive strategies, not for reading in the conventional sense, but for writing text, for constituting their properties and assigning their intentions. Therefore, interpretations and meanings come from the reader's perception of the world, and one shapes the reading and thus the reading thereof, or the interpretation thereof. This theory supports the fact that every piece of literature has no meaning on its own. The readers hold supremacy as the experiences with the text determine its truth. Good Black Woman, as a resistance song, has a spiritual harmony, of which its harmonies compel you to be introspective. Brenda, in the second half of the song, explains. I will try translating this one. Izingane zethu zithi thula mama nyamezela. Nyamezela nawe Mandela. Siyakhala sonke isizwe. Nawe Sobukwe, further later nawe Sisulu siyanikhumbula lapho nihlezi khona. Ophezulu nguye oyaziyo konke kuzulu. Here, so in essence what she's talking about, she's in a way tapping into the idea of resistance and enduring to the process, or if you wish, the process at the time and the climate of the time where there was political unrest, and being resilient that there will be change, right?
So here Brenda does two things. On a first level of analysis, she shifts us from the conversation where she negotiates with the police officer to accept her as the good woman, right? She then locates herself within the deeper conversation that informs why she has to have the interaction with the police officer in that particular manner. The idea of endurance, resilience, that was and is surrounded with the struggle for one's humanity in the context of a racist and supremacist country at the time. A reference of Mandela Sobukweni Sisulu references some of the leaders of the movement whom have sacrificed, right, for the movement itself. Secondly, a reference of these leaders can be deemed problematic as they are exclusively male. Assuming and conceding that Brenda's music is reflective of the narratives of society, I want to argue this part of the song addresses the strong black woman syndrome, of which Tillman argues is a concept that is rooted in a historical, socially constructed context where a strong black woman is an emotionally self-sufficient woman who is responsible for meeting the needs of others in her family and communities before herself. Also worth noting is the beginning of the verse, the opening looking at the arrest of her brother, of which the absenteeism of fathers is a product of the apartheid and the system and the colony. These are children that grew up with watching their mothers crumble at the memory of their fathers, crumble at the reality that they may never come back. Resilience may have been a chorus that was sang in their presence, and now they are repeating it to their mothers, the brother. This absenteeism of fathers, of brothers, of son is also prevalent in today's society and arguably influences how black women relate to black men in society today. How then do we locate this as feminist thought if it fails to critique the dominance of heteronormativity? Taking into account, as Nayemeka would argue, that African feminism exists as a critique of patriarchal principles that exist to exploit women. I want to then argue that here Brenda invites us to engage with the identity of a black woman in relation to black men and in relation to coloniality. In 2013, Busiswa released a club banger which hit the charts known as Ungoku, featuring Oskido and Gqulu. Busiswa, who's a poet and house singer, has interestingly dominated songs where she has been a featured artist as opposed to her solo projects. Of course, we've seen this change with her album in 2017, Highly Flavored, where there is also a different element with the aesthetics of her brand, which I'll touch on a little bit later. Worth noting is how Busiswa brings to the forefront female sexuality. This is against the backdrop of the house music industry being a male-dominated and male-led industry. Fundamentally so, we have seen the dominance of Gqulu music, which is a popular dancehall genre, which provocative, sexualized, and erotic dance moves accompany the fusion of the beats. In her song Gogu, about a club situation gone wrong, well, at least for the man, she says, I'll try and translate this one as well. She says, Nababa brother, bayadimanda, bacing bafanba, auction buyer. So ke mamela, asbabonise, asfan nabasis aba, bafunu kubayo. So basically she's saying, I've just walked into a club and there is this audience of males that have assumed that I am up for auction, right? And I'm not like those women that are up for, or that can be bought. Then she says, Ndimnaye, estikini, ndisifikele kaloku, kulomcimbi, ndidikidikiwe, cingbuyatenga, ndithi sorry, iti sorry, not ngomso kaloku, sorry. So here she says, we're meeting estikini, assuming estiki is like a passage or some intersection on the dance floor. And she's like, well, I arrived. It's in the middle, thank you. So I've arrived at the spot by myself, and therefore you should not take responsibility for your ownership, right? So what Busiswa does in the song is that she challenges the intentions of her male audience and her resistance to be taken under their ownership. Secondly, I want to argue that there is an unsettling thought within the stance that she takes. If we are to concede that music is a reflection of society and its reflections on women, house music and Gqulu, as a masculine space, carries a male gaze and audience, meaning that house
music, and poem are predominantly for the production of the male gaze. This thus begs the question, how effective is the narrative that she argues in her song when the gaze remains the same, or the reality remains the same? Sarah made in referencing, on Fanon says that Fanon teaches us to watch out for what lurks, seeing himself in and as of the shadow, the dark body who is always passing by at the edges of social experience. In seeing the stranger, we are most certainly seeing someone, and in some cases, we are seeing ourselves. Can we then argue that in seeing and in critiquing this sexualization or this ownership, Busiswa feeds into the expected, already waiting male gaze and audience? Although Busiswa is firm in her rejection of that sexualization, one has to note that society has a stereotypical perception about Xhosa women, of which Busiswa is. The popular narrative, mostly on social media, is that Xhosa women of all the other ethnic groups are the most cheeky and difficult women. Fundamentally so. One can argue that her ngoku illustrates a form of agitation as well. At the fact that women are being seen in this one-dimensional analysis, that they can be bought or want to be bought, and instead argues that there are women that exist within both those categories. Critical discourse analysis has three elements: interdiscursivity, intertextuality, as well as dialogicality. I argue that these lines in Brenda Fassie's verse, where she addresses the policeman about his bad attitude, interdiscursively and to an extent, dialogicality can be drawn. These elements, with reference to these songs, are parallel readings of activism that seek to highlight lived experiences of black women in relation to both black and white. I argue class coloniality and apartheid and gender-based violence addressed by these artists respectively. I further argue that urgency and memory coexist. All right. I won't get to the second thing. Okay, so I'll engage it in Q&A. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Siphokazi. So, because we started late, we've gone over into tea time. So, would you guys be willing to stick around for questions during tea time? Okay, they're willing to sit for over tea time, but you're more than welcome to go to tea. It's right next door. But if you do have questions, they will sit over tea time. So, do we have any questions? Does anybody want to stick around? Yes.
So first a quick comment for Siphokazi and Julie and Lerato. What was so deeply affirming about what you did was to also the frame of your narrative, where the storytelling is also the theory building. And I thought that was deeply powerful in terms of how that just position yourselves. Because when you're talking about when you're doing the translations, I was thinking about she talks about translation as a process of subjectification. So the translation itself, so often we think of translation as language to language, and there's a purity of language positions in either case. When often in all of those, there's impurity across, so it becomes kind of a continuous cycle. And I was wondering about thinking in connection to how you're thinking of interpretation as to think through interpretation and translation. So interpretation becomes by the position around which the speaker and the audience, there's no singularity, there's no difference. And yet it seems also in both cases that black women at the site of difference become productive in both. It's a site of difference that is productive as a site of difference around which that those two cycles work, and that I thought that was interesting. Also, I was thinking, I could hear TLC like, I'm so good at being bad, as you were speaking. And so that non-dualistic, the capacity for a deep non-dichotomous way of thinking that I think was, I was really interested in. I've talked too much, I won't address this, but I have things to say if I'm allowed, but I'll shut it down.
You're not.
Okay. Lerato.
First do the second question.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for the papers. And my question is directed to Thulisile and Siphokazi. And my question is about the position of women in drum and what seems to be the Afrobeat moment. And so in a way, Brenda starts from the 80s and she's able to thrive even through the whiter moment. But I'm not so sure how women are appearing in Gqulu. Of course, we have a Busiswa, but it doesn't seem as if we have enough Busiswas in this moment. And so women appear mostly as women in the music videos, and mostly they are light-skinned. And so what are the colorism politics of this moment? And so of course with Afrobeat, you know, Davido is reigning king. You have your Tiwa Savages, you have your Niviolas now. But what are the gender politics of this particular moment, and what are the continuities between Kwaito and Gqulu and this music moment? But the other question is around Thulisile's point about how the Romans also sort of uses bravado, you know, so dance hall gives access to bravado, and I've been struck by how, in a way, Beyonce's move to rapping is also accessing what is usually black men's use of bravado. And so in this underwhelming album with her husband, she out-dances him, she out-sings him, out-raps him. And it's exciting because black women can do that kind of thing. But I just wonder that in a way then we have to do everything, you know. So she doesn't, you know, she can't be the best singer in the world. You know, for her to be king, she really must do everything. And yet, in the New York Times interview, he's still able to say that he makes art and she makes music. You know, and yet, of course, we know that she's the king in this creation, and she's making the art. So two black women then really, in terms of accessing that authority, have to move into that male space, and what do they really achieve? Okay, I'll stop there.
Should we listen to the guy's question also? Was that a question?
No, you don't have to listen to me as well as saying.
Do your question and then they can answer.
Okay, I'll be really quick. Lerato, in terms of what you're saying is an affective kind of landscape, I was wondering if you pushed further to think about, so you begin with the material, the kind of aspects of material body and the hair, and then you end with this kind of, what that virtual extension of the body does, and why landscape. I was trying to push you in terms of saying an affective. What other ways of extending the body could you frame that? And when you talk about sort of, there's something when you play the sound. So we have the oral, but also it's not just the oral. It's also other kinds of an affective dimension that's produced. And so there's something that's deeply embodied in terms of knowing that, and your choice not to use visual text, and not to talk and not to describe lyrics. Right? So I was wanting to push you to say something about a sonic body in terms of that connection.
With regards to the sonic bit, like that was the tough bit, the tough part for me, because my supervisor as well was always pushing me to actually describe and say what was feminist in the music itself. And that for me was very difficult because it meant ascribing meanings to sound. And like that's a tough thing to do. I can't, what is it about that sound? What is it about that certain musical note that makes it feminist? Like it's me having to grapple with that. And now it like pushes me to a different kind of conversation where it's like, can sound itself have meaning or provoke a certain meaning when it's played in a certain way? And I avoid it completely, like describing. That's how I babbled on and on about theory, because I was like, I was very apprehensive to actually describe this music or the sound itself, because I feel like music should be something that's malleable and that's something that you can make it. You have to make it your own. So if I ascribe certain meaning to a sound, then it's a huge step, it's a huge thing. Because then if someone else uses it, then it's going to be like that thing that has been described now. And do I even have the right to use that is also something else that comes up a lot for me. And then with regards to the question, you brought up the point about women always having to assimilate to the genres is a good point, and I feel like it's something that continues to happen all the time. And I think of now Siphokazi's talk about about Busiswa, and I can't help but feel like, yes, Gqulu in a way is kind of continued over from what Kwaito has done in the sense that it's male dominated. But now it's like there aren't any black women DJs in Gqulu at all. So it's as if we've been cancelled out as well. And Busiswa's entry into Gqulu was as a feature. And you think of Moonchild Sanele as well, she's also a feature. And they're obviously pushing it forward and like their presence is important. But they're still aren't the owners of that. They're still not dominating that space in a commercial way as well. Like in terms of like the business aspect, like do they own their music? They don't. It's Kelela, Jasmine, and are they the ones creating that for themselves? They don't, and it's like.
Tembi said that. Sorry.
Oh.
Just saying.
But she's the only one, and also she's like still benefiting from like a Kwaito era. So I think that's another.
I think I started with the body because I thought that she really centered her body in these narratives. But I did hear about extending the body. I think she kind of destabilized the idea of the body. And in terms of landscape, I think I chose that term, to be honest, because I kept thinking about The Sims. And it's really, in The Sims, like when you enter a neighborhood, that's what they call these lands, and it's a map, essentially. And I kept thinking, not necessarily about land, but a terrain. But terrain didn't feel like the right term either. A landscape felt less about land, but more about this space, this very flat space through which she builds up these ideas and these thoughts around what you can move through. But I don't know if landscape is really the right word to think about also these rural spaces that she moves through. Because she's driving a car, but she's also just moving through these spaces in various ways. And because it's a digital based visual, I think landscape isn't useful in thinking about just how space is constituted. It's not three-dimensional, it's not two-dimensional, it's this very fluid thing.
I'm just going to touch on just like one element of it. I think like in terms of what Doc's question in terms of whether we see a continuity between, like Kwaito and Gqulu. And I think like, because what Kwaito very loosely was a combination of different cultures coming together. You saw people like Tebe, who was Tswana in a Kwaito space, and then Zulu, who was Zulu. There was that mash of cultures, right? And Gqulu in itself does that as well. It's this mashing of certain Afro beats with some electro beats also like coming together. Very interestingly, you talk about features. A lot of the featured Gqulu artists, I think, carry more content than some of the Gqulu artists that don't get featured. So, for example, you look at Busiswa's brand changing a little bit, and I'll address maybe the interpretations of it, which fits almost into the second half of what I was going to touch on. You look at Busiswa's brand changing a little bit aesthetically with the introduction of Babes becoming a little bit more sexual, right? But Babes doesn't really carry a lot of content as opposed to Busiswa in her lyrics. There's barely content there. And for me, Busiswa's a spoken word artist, such as like Youngsta, as Kerry was talking. I find those traces because her first engagement with Kalawa was as a poet, and then they come and they say, why don't you try this against this beat, right? In terms of like interpretation, maybe we could talk about this, Dr. Lai, if you wish. What I do in the second half, as well as do like just some weird migration of looking at Brenda's lifestyle as a queer artist, right? And particularly the video of Weekend Special, she dances alone. But in Lahla from Busiswa dances with this vintage dance crew, of which has openly gay members. And so what I want to then argue in that space is that there's a migration of her lifestyle into aesthetically how Busiswa performs with bad usage, and that creates that conversation in a very masculine heteronormative space when you have queer dancers, right? So, yeah.
Are we done? Any more questions?
No, no time.
Any more questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.